If you would, grab a Bible with me and turn with me to the book of Proverbs, chapter 1. Proverbs, chapter 1. That is where we will be studying tonight. We'll be in the book of Proverbs, particularly these first 9 chapters, as we talk tonight for a few minutes about young people and about our need for wisdom at whatever stage of life that we're in. Proverbs, chapter 1 is where we'll be in just a moment. This is my last time to be before you in this series of lessons this week. And so I have a few things that I need to say, so if you would pardon me for just a moment. I have to say thank you. And there are a whole bunch of you, so I cannot say it thank you to each one by name. Plus, I have to confess this, some of you, I'm not sure what your names are. I tried to learn them. I learned several of you, but there were so many names. There are so many of you. You have been so kind to me and so encouraging to me. And I know what it means for you to come to me and to say words of encouragement, to tell me how things have helped you and benefited you, to tell me how much you have been studying and appreciate the leadership in study. That just means so much to me. I know that you don't have to say that. And I know that if it wasn't true, you wouldn't say it. And so I want to tell you from the bottom of my heart how much I appreciate your encouragement to me this week. I appreciate you being kind to me and being kind to my family as they've been able to be with me off and on in different configurations most of the week. I want to say how much I appreciate those who have had me in their homes, who have made food, who have taken me out, and who have taken care of our physical needs. Just thank you so much. I have really enjoyed getting to know you. I've really enjoyed being with you this week, and I'm so thankful for this opportunity. My prayer for you individually and for this congregation is that what we have done and the words that God has given that we have tried to dig into this week will be a blessing to you going forward. As Bruce said, now comes the work. Now comes what do we do? Now that we've learned so much and we've dug so deeply, how are we changed by this? As James says, it's not enough for us to just be hearers of the word, we have to be doers. And so the question comes, well, what is Thursday going to look like based on what we've thought about on Wednesday? And so I appreciate that so much, and my prayer is that this will be a benefit to me and to all of us together. So thank you so much for a great week. Proverbs chapter 1, beginning in verse 1, the text says, "The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, to know wisdom and instruction, to understand words of insight, to receive instruction in wise dealing, in righteousness, justice, and equity, to give prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the youth. Let the wise hear and increase in learning, and the one who understands obtain guidance. To understand a proverb and a saying, the words of the wise and their riddles. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction." So what is it that we should expect from young people? What kind of lives should we expect young people to lead? What kinds of decisions should we expect young people to make? What kinds of morality should they have? What level of engagement should they have even in a local church? What should we expect? It seems to me, both from observation and personal experience, that we don't expect very much from young people. We set the bar pretty low. I remember being a young person. I have been young. I still consider myself young, but some of the young people would disagree. In my experience, I remember being young, being a teenager, and people being surprised and encouraging me just for the smallest things that I could do. If I would stay awake, they would say, "Wow, what a fine young man that is." If I went to church, wow. If I had my Bible with me somewhere that wasn't a church building, wow. And in particular, if there were things that other young people were involved in and I said, "I'm not going to do that," well, as long as I didn't do those things, that was pretty great. In the little town that I grew up in, I don't know how it is here, in the little town that I grew up in, it was just so exciting to the young people that were my age to go out into the pasture and to find somebody who would buy them beer and to get drunk. Sometimes they would make fires, and sometimes they would shoot guns. And that was a great time. And I'm sorry, that has never appealed to me. It didn't appeal to me when I was 16, and it doesn't appeal to me now. But just saying no to that, well, that's a pretty low bar, isn't it? It seems to me that expectations matter when we talk about young people, because what we expect determines the kind of people that they're going to choose to be. I've done a lot of research and a lot of thinking about expectations. Sometimes in what is called the placebo effect, when fake medicine is given to people, they will actually get better because they expect medicine to help them. When we eat food or drink drinks that is said to be more expensive, we think they taste better because we are expecting them to taste better. Teachers who expect more from their students get more from their students. And in so many different areas, you can see this applied by different studies that have been performed. And it seems to me that that is precisely what the book of Proverbs is. Proverbs is about expectations. And it is about not what we expect, but what God expects of young people. Now, first of all, we need to say that Proverbs is addressed directly to young people. Look at Proverbs 1 and verse 4. It says, to give prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the youth. It is for young people, and many of the things, particularly in this section that we're going to study tonight, are addressed specifically by Solomon to his son. And it is written in the style of a father speaking to his son. Over and over again, he talks about his son and his need for wisdom. Now, I don't know if Solomon had one particular son in mind, or if this is just a style that he is saying, I'm the one giving the wisdom, you need to be the one learning, as a child would learn from his father. But one way or other, we get to the same point, don't we, where we say this is for young people particularly. So when we look at what God says and what God expects, we see a dramatically different set of expectations. God is the one who tells us about young men like Joseph, who resists sexual temptation when no one would know. God tells us about fine young men who are kings, who do great things as young kings, like Josiah. God tells us about Daniel, who far away from home risks his life on multiple occasions when no one would have known had he done different. God tells us about Moses, who at a young age made a decision not to live it up in the king's palace, but to do God's will with all the afflictions that accompanied it. God tells us about Timothy, who at a very young age begins to learn God's word and at a very young age begins to preach God's word. God tells us that young people can do amazing things and can be a force for Him. Those expectations, that's where we need to set our expectations for our young people. And so it is that I want us to look at the book of Proverbs and talk about how it applies and shows us what young people should be according to God's expectations. And we're going to talk just about 4 things that God expects from young people. 4 things, and the lesson will be yours. Let me tell you a little bit about how we're going to do this tonight. What we're going to do is I'm going to put a point on the board, and we are going to read, rapid fire, a number of passages that all confirm to the same point. And so we're going to study Proverbs, but we're going to study it rather quickly. Proverbs are Proverbs because they say it the best way there is to say it. So I'm not going to add too much of my own commentary to this. So let's begin by saying God expects young people to listen to wisdom. To listen to wisdom. That, of course, is the essence of the book of Proverbs. Do you insist on doing things your own way, or are you willing to listen to somebody else who might know better than you? So Proverbs 1 and verse 4, Proverbs 1 and 4, to give prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the youth, let the wise hear and increase in learning, and the one who understands obtain guidance. In chapter 1 and verse 7, he says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. Fools despise it. That's going to mean we're going to have to admit that we don't know everything. That is the beginning of wisdom. Fearing God because God knows more than we do and learning to listen. Go with me to chapter 3 of Proverbs. Chapter 3 and verse 7. Proverbs 3 and verse 7 says, be not wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil. It will be healing to your flesh and refreshment to your bones. Be not wise in your own eyes. Trust that somebody else knows better than you and that you don't know it all. Go with me to chapter 8 and verse 13. Proverbs 8 and verse 13. Proverbs 8:13 says, "The fear of the Lord is hatred of evil. Pride and arrogance and the way of evil and perverted speech I hate." Pride and arrogance are the enemies of wisdom, because if I think I already know, why would I listen to you? Why would I need the Bible? I think I've already got it figured out. So there is an expectation that young people will be willing to listen. Part of that is going to mean we have to recognize how much we need it. Go with me to chapter 3, Proverbs 3, beginning in verse 1. Proverbs 3 and verse 1, "My son, do not forget my teaching, but let your heart keep my commandments. For length of days and years of life and peace they will add to you. Let not steadfast love and faithfulness forsake you. Bind them around your neck. Write them on the tablet of your heart, so you will find favor and good success in the sight of God and man." Isn't that the way you want to live? Favor, good success in the sight of God and man? Then listen. Listen to my teaching. Hear me. Receive wisdom from somebody who's already been down the road you're traveling. Listen to me. In chapter 2 and verse 16, he says, "So you will be delivered from the forbidden woman, from the adulteress with her smooth words, who forsakes the companion of her youth and forgets the covenant of her God, and her house sinks down to death and her paths to the departed." So wisdom, he says, will protect you and deliver you. It will spare you needless pain. He is warning that if we fail to listen, we will suffer. We need wisdom. This is where I believe young people struggle. Because when we are young, very often we have not seen how hard and sad life can be. We have not seen, as those who are older have seen, how people make a wreck of their lives. How people make terrible decisions. What sin does to people. And so we begin to think when we are young, well, maybe I'm just different. I've never seen that happen. It hasn't happened to me. I've done that, and nothing happened. Or maybe we think that we should attack the person who's trying to help us and say, well, they don't know anything. That older person, he's just against everything. He's an old curmudgeon. He's a fuss budget. He just doesn't like it. Or maybe he just doesn't want me to have any fun. And so we say, wisdom, I'm not really interested in that because it goes against what I would like to do. But I want to say this to our young people. One reason that the people who have a few more years on the odometer of their life, one reason they talk so much to young people and say so much about the dangers of certain ways of life is because they have seen so much damage. They have seen so many people who have started down an unwise road and got all the way to the end of it. They have seen so many people who have ended their marriages with infidelity. They have seen so many people who began with some small step and ended up addicted to some substance for the rest of their lives, fighting against that addiction. They've seen so many people who made one or two bad decisions and ruined their lives and the lives of others. They've seen so many people. I will never forget a lady who was in her 80s at the time, speaking to me about the pain that came because she had married someone who was not a Christian and never did become a Christian through his whole life. And as she sat there and broke down in tears, she said to me, "I just wish someone had told me." She hurt. And to know people who hurt their whole lives because of some small decision made in their youth, it only takes a few of those before you begin to gain some wisdom and say, you know what? If somebody starts down that road, I'm going to tell them where that goes. And if they don't like me and they think I'm a fuss budget, I'll be okay. I don't know if you guys have heard that word, but I'm going to keep using it. And can I say this? In a lot of cases, the reason that older people say what they say in wisdom is because they've been down that road too. See, we have our experience in sin too. And we know what sin is and what it does. And when we say don't go down that road, it's because we don't want you to suffer like we've suffered. It would be wiser to listen than to argue. And one of the reasons that this is difficult is because wisdom sometimes tells us that we're not going to get to do what we really want to do. And that's a battle that we all have to fight, young or old. Are we going to do what we want, or are we going to do what's wise? Go with me back to chapter 1 of Proverbs. In chapter 1 and verse 22. In chapter 1 and verse 22, he says, this is wisdom crying out, "How long, O simple ones, will you love being simple? How long will scoffers delight in their scoffing, and fools hate knowledge? If you turn at my reproof, behold, I will pour out my spirit to you. I will make my words known to you, because I have called and you refuse to listen, have stretched out my hand and no one has heeded, because you have ignored all my counsel and would have none of my reproof. I also will laugh at your calamity. I will mock when terror strikes you." So you can ignore wisdom, but you cannot opt out of the consequences of ignoring wisdom. You can go down that path, but you will suffer. And wisdom says, I will mock you at that time because you refuse to hear. But remember, Proverbs is addressed to a son. Proverbs is addressed to the young. God expects us to put aside all our thoughts and opinions and to listen to wisdom. Second, God expects young people to involve Him in their lives. Proverbs 1 and verse 7. Proverbs 1 and verse 7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Respecting God means that there is someone we must listen to. We fear Him. We respect Him. He is a part of our lives. God has made the world to work in certain ways. It's going to work that way. Fearing God means I respect the way God made the world to work. The world works according to certain patterns. Whatever a man sows, Paul says, that he will also reap. Actions have consequences. And wisdom says, if I do this, this follows. That's the way God made the world to work. If I respect God, I'm going to respect the world the way He's made it. I'm not going to think that I can live the way I want without consequence. That's not the way God works. That's not the way the world works. And if I involve God in my life, I'm going to involve His way in my decisions. Go with me to chapter 3 and verse 5. Chapter 3 and verse 5. Proverbs 3 and verse 5. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will make straight your paths. Trust the Lord, not yourself, not your own understanding. The temptation for young and old is to think that we are in charge and that we know best, and we lean on our own thinking. And He says, trust the Lord, not yourself. Be aware of Him, involve Him, and He'll direct your paths. Verse 9, chapter 3 and verse 9, honor the Lord with your wealth and with the first fruits of all your produce. Then your barns will be filled with plenty, and your vats will be bursting with wine. So this is about sharing with other people and sharing with God what He's given us. Young people, as we begin to make money, as we begin to grow up and we get jobs and things start coming in, what are we going to do with that? Are we going to respect God's rules with what we spend and how we spend and how we think about what we have now? Do we honor God with our wealth? God wants us to involve Him in our lives even when we're young. Chapter 3 and verse 11. My son, do not despise the Lord's discipline or be weary of His reproof, for the Lord reproves him whom He loves, as a father the son in whom He delights. So when things go bad, when you have trouble in your life and difficulty, this encouragement is, don't be angry at God. God can help you and bless you even through hard times, but you have to walk through those understanding that God might be disciplining you in some way. He might be smoothing out your rough edges. He might be blessing you, even though it doesn't feel like it in the moment. But that's only something that someone who involves God in their lives would think about. Turn over to chapter 6 in Proverbs 6 and verse 16. Proverbs 6 and verse 16 says, there are 6 things that the Lord hates, 7 that are an abomination to him. Haughty eyes, a lying tongue, and hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked plans, feet that make haste to run to evil, a false witness who breathes out lies, and one who sows discord among brothers. So there are things that God hates. There are lifestyles to be avoided. There are actions that we have to say no to. These are things God wants us not to be and not to do. God expects young people to involve Him in their lives. That is a challenge in our time. Because even though we live in a part of a country that traditionally has been Christian, it is exceedingly rare to find people who regularly speak about, think about, pray to, study about, focus on God on a daily basis. That's very rare. That's very rare, young and old. Involving God in our lives is going to mean that we march to the beat of a different drummer than the rest of our world. It's going to have to be a conscious choice that I make to respect His expectations, to listen to His word, to honor Him with my money, to think about what He's doing in my life. All of that is something that I must choose, even if it's going against the grain of those around me. But you know, this is what makes it difficult for young people. It's really hard to convince young people to not make bad decisions, because God says that's a bad decision, if the only time they hear from God is when it's to tell them no about a decision they want to make. I mean, really, how would we feel if we had a parent who only showed up to tell us no? And the only time we ever heard from him was as soon as some fun was about to happen, here they come out of the woodwork to say, you can't do that. God wants to be in a relationship with us that is not just about don't do that. But we have to choose that. We have to involve Him in our lives. And perhaps those of us who are older need to do a better job in exemplifying this to those who are younger. Showing them that God is not only a Sunday and Wednesday type of thing. That this is who we are. And this is what we talk about and think about all the time. This consumes our hearts and minds. It is the lens through which we look at our jobs, and the lens through which we look at our families, and the lens through which we look at the future, and the lens through which we see and interpret the current events of our world. Everything goes back to God. That's what God expects even of young people. Third, God expects young people to see past deception. One of the major themes in the book of Proverbs is the idea that things are not always what they appear to be. And wisdom is the ability to see past the deception to what's really there. There are 2 things, 2 scenes that are drawn in this section of Proverbs that we're going to look at carefully here that are major ideas of how that works for young people. One of them involves friends. Look with me in chapter 1 of Proverbs. Chapter 1 and verse 10. Proverbs 1 and verse 10 says, "My son, if sinners entice you, do not consent. If they say, 'Come with us, let us lie in wait for blood. Let us ambush the innocent without reason. Like Sheol, let us swallow them alive, and whole like those who go down to the pit. We shall find all precious goods. We shall fill our houses with plunder. Throw in your lot among us. We will all have one purse. My son, do not walk in the way with them. Hold back your foot from their paths, for their feet run to evil, and they make haste to shed blood. For in vain is a net spread in the sight of any bird. But these men lie in wait for their own blood. They set an ambush for their own lives. Such are the ways of everyone who is greedy for unjust gain. It takes away the life of its possessors." So here is the appeal of a group of friends wanting to do evil together. Don't get hung up on the idea of what they're doing, the idea of how they're hurting someone or stealing from them. It is the idea of let's conspire together to do something bad. And the influence that can have, where something bad becomes contagious, where all the objections seem to fade away in the power of that group, where suddenly we see a way we can do something that would really make us happy. And in the bargain, we get to have the approval of those around us. And there is a strong pull in others encouraging us to go along with them in their sin. And so what Solomon says in warning about that is that you need to see there's more to this than it appears. Particularly, I want you to notice verse 18. It says, these men lie in wait for their own blood. They set an ambush for their own lives. They think they're going to hurt somebody else, but the only one they're hurting is themselves. They are going to destroy themselves this night, and you don't want to be a part of it. He says, don't even walk near them. Don't be anywhere around them. You don't want any part in this. You need to see past what's going on. It appears to be a certain way, but it's not. It looks like just some friends having fun, but it's not. And he expects young people to say, I know better than this. I see the deception, and I won't have any part in it. The other major image in this section of Proverbs is the idea of sexual immorality, illustrated by an immoral woman. Look with me in chapter 2 of Proverbs in verse 16. It says, chapter 2 and 16, we read this earlier, so you will be delivered from the forbidden woman, from the adulteress with her smooth words, who forsakes the companion of her youth and forgets the covenant of her God. For her house sinks down to death and her paths to the departed. None who go to her come back, nor do they regain the paths of life. Do you notice the end there? How what at first just appears to be a beautiful woman, enticing, instead is a deception. Really, it leads to death. Go with me over to chapter 5. Proverbs chapter 5. Verse 3. Proverbs 5 and verse 3. For the lips of a forbidden woman drip honey, and her speech is smoother than oil. But in the end she is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. Her feet go down to death. Her steps follow the path to Sheol. She does not ponder the path of life. Her ways wander, and she does not know it. She is deceptive because her lips say one thing, but she's really leading you towards something else. In the end, verse 4, she is as bitter as wormwood. Those are the words, brothers and sisters, of a man who's been burned. He is saying this is not what it appears to be. I wonder if Solomon is speaking from his own experience. I don't know that. But at the very least, he could speak from his father's experience. He knew that. David knew that. And Solomon can say, you are a fool. You are a fool to think that this is not going to end the way it always ends. He says that to young people. Look in chapter 7 with me, in Proverbs 7. Proverbs 7 and verse 6, he says, for at the window of my house I have looked out through my lattice. I have seen among the simple, I have perceived among the youths, a young man lacking sense. Notice how it's addressed to young people. Passing along the street near her corner, taking the road to her house in the twilight and the evening at the time of night and darkness. And he describes through this section, we're not going to read it tonight, he describes through this section how this woman, this forbidden woman, comes out and appeals to him and seduces this young man and takes him back to her place. Verse 22, all at once he follows her as an ox goes to the slaughter, or as a stag is caught fast till an arrow pierces its liver, as a bird rushes into a snare. He does not know that it will cost him his life. And now, O sons, listen to me, and be attentive to the words of my mouth. Let not your heart turn aside to her ways. Do not stray into her paths, for many a victim she has laid low, and all her slain are a mighty throng. Her house is the way to Sheol, going down to the chambers of death. Sheol, by the way, is the word for the grave. She will kill you. This will ruin your life. And the images he uses, he says it's like a bird flying into a snare. Doesn't even see it coming, just flying along, and all of a sudden, his life is over. Like a deer shot. Suddenly, life is over. Things appear to be one way, and then all of a sudden, it's not at all that way, and it never will be again. There is deception here. And God expects young people to see past it and to see the danger and to run away. Young people need a perceptiveness. The word is discernment. The ability to look at a situation or a person and realize that not everything is what it appears to be. That is a skill of wisdom. So how do I know the difference between someone who is what they appear to be and someone who is not? Well, is that person? What is it that they are encouraging me to do or to think? And what do I know about that thing that they're encouraging me to do or to think? What does God say about that? What do the people whose wisdom I trust say about that action? What is that person's life like? If I follow their advice, am I going to end up living like them? And do I want that? Is this really necessary? Someone often urges us on the basis of necessity. Everyone is doing this. You need to do it. You've got to do it. Is it really necessary? If I waited 24 hours, would I still want to do it? And then there are the great questions of wisdom that we ask before any action. How will I feel after I've done it? Has anybody else ever done it? How did it go for them? What does God think about this? Is this something I'm going to regret? If Jesus were to come back, would I want him to find me doing it? Those are wisdom questions that say there might be something that looks good, but if they fail that test, then perhaps we're being deceived. God expects young people to ask those kinds of questions. God expects young people to see past the deception. That is not simply a skill for those who are older. That is something he says you need it, or else you're going to fall into the same traps you're being warned about. And the fourth thing is that God expects young people to choose wisdom over impulse. I want you to go with me to chapter 6 of Proverbs. Proverbs 6. Proverbs 6 and verse 6 says, "Go to the ant, O sluggard, consider her ways and be wise. Without having any chief, officer, or ruler, she prepares her bread in summer and gathers her food in harvest. How long will you lie there, O sluggard? When will you arise from your sleep? A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come upon you like a robber, and want like an armed man." If you ever wonder if there is anything funny in the Bible, read through what the Proverbs say about the sluggard. Because it's really funny. It's comical. And yet to see someone living that way is tragic. Here is a man who all he wants is a little more sleep, a little more, a little more, a little more. And he says that's the way to poverty. See, that is a decision that is impulse versus wisdom. The impulse is, I don't feel like it. I feel like staying in bed. But the wisdom is, if I stay in bed, I'll lose my job. The wisdom says, if I want to eat tomorrow, I need to get up. God expects young people to choose wisdom over impulse. In fact, the picture that he presents to our young people in this text is the picture of the ant. The ant who doesn't need anybody coming along behind him saying, everybody up, out of the anthill, let's go, let's go. Notice what he says, verse 7. Without having any chief, officer, or ruler, she prepares her bread in summer and gathers her food in harvest. How is it that we could be so impulsive that we have less wisdom than an ant? He says we can do better than that if we choose wisdom over impulse. Back in chapter 5 of Proverbs, chapter 5 and verse 7. This is again speaking of the immoral woman. Chapter 5 and verse 7. "Now, O sons, listen to me. Do not depart from the words of my mouth. Keep your way far from her. And do not go near the door of her house, lest you give your honor to others and your years to the merciless. Lest strangers take their fill of your strength and your labors go to the house of a foreigner. And at the end of your life you groan when your flesh and body are consumed. And you say, how I hated discipline, and my heart despised reproof. I did not listen to the voice of my teachers or incline my ear to my instructors. I am at the brink of utter ruin in the assembled congregation." Notice that these are wisdom considerations. You'll lose your honor, Your flesh and your body are consumed. You look back with tremendous regret saying, I was so close, and yet I was in the middle of this congregation, and I still didn't listen to my teachers. Everybody was telling me I knew it from a child, and yet here I am, choosing impulse over wisdom. He says, you must do better. Please understand. Impulse is a problem for everyone. Impulse is a problem because it appeals to fleshly desires. The desire for relief, the desire for rest, the desire for gratification of some kind, the desire to relieve stress. Impulse says, if I just do this, everything will be fine. And the danger is that when we live by impulse, we don't live wisely. Have you ever written out a budget for the month? And then get stressed out and ruin the budget for that month with something you buy? Have you ever said, you know what? I am going to lose weight starting tomorrow. And then maybe within a day or two or three, you've eaten so much that you've gained that weight back. What happened? We know what we really need. That's wisdom. But we have such a hard time getting to where wisdom would take us because we are fighting impulse. That's what these texts are describing. Wisdom says, I want what could be so much that I'm willing to endure some difficulty in the here and now. I want it so bad that I'll suffer for a little while now. And we, old and young, must grow past impulsivity. That is the warning of Proverbs. If you want to achieve something in your life, you must rely on wisdom, not impulse. If you want to pursue goals that matter, if you want to develop relationships, if you want to be the man or woman God's called you to be, you must choose wisdom over impulse. This is the ultimate choice for our young people. Where are you headed with your life? If we just rely on impulse, there is no direction, there is no focus, there are no goals. But we can do better than that. God expects that we be like Moses. Moses refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to have the treasures of Egypt. Moses chose wisdom over impulse. He chose to serve God with the difficulty in the moment because he had a vision for something greater. The text in Hebrews 11 says he looked to the reward beyond where he was, beyond the difficulty now. And God expects young people to be like Moses, to look beyond just what we're feeling and wanting in this small moment. I want to look at one last verse in Proverbs chapter 22. It's outside the range of what we've been studying. But I believe it's a good summary for what we've talked about. All of this wisdom discussion, all of these expectations, have with them a danger. That when we ignore wisdom, we ignore it because we ignore it and we fall prey to the danger that the wisdom is there to protect us from. Proverbs 22 and verse 3 says this: "The prudent sees danger and hides himself, but the simple go on and suffer for it." So my question to all of us, young and old, is which one of those are we going to be? When we see danger, what do? He says, the prudent sees danger and hides himself. I'm going to protect myself. I'm going to get away from the danger. I'm going to be careful. But the foolish go on and suffer for it. So what kind of person are you going to be? Are you going to be the kind of person who ignores warnings? Are you going to be the kind of person who has very little thought of God in their life? Are you going to be the kind of person who is easily deceived? Are you going to be the kind of person who says, I'm just going to live by the seat of my pants, do whatever I feel like today? Or will you be the kind of person who sees danger and hides himself? Who says, I'm going to be careful to do what's wise in this situation. I want to do what God says. I want to be careful about someone trying to hurt me in some way or some danger that I might not fully perceive. And I'm going to choose what's wise over what I feel like. This is not too much to ask of our young people. Asking our young people for a detailed explanation of Revelation, that might be too much. Asking our young people to be perfect might be too much. But asking our young people to be the kind of wise person God calls them to be is not too much. That is what we should all expect. But before those of us who are a little older try to sneak out the building without having anything applied to us, can I just remind you that all of these things are true for all of us? That every single one of us, no matter how old and wise we become, we always must listen. We always need God involved in our lives. We always have to be on the lookout for those who are trying to deceive us, and we need discernment in that area. And all of us need to choose wisdom over impulse. God has blessed us with wisdom to navigate life, but He wants a relationship that is deeper than simply living life like He wants. He wants us to involve Him and to be His children. And so if you're here tonight and you need to have a relationship with God, it's not just about living the best life, although certainly God leads us toward the best kind of life we can live. But it is also about the hope of life after this life that Jesus died to give us hope of. And so if you're here tonight and you need to accept that message and to believe in Jesus as the Messiah, the Son of God, turn away from your sins and be buried with Him in baptism, if there is any need that you have tonight, we invite you to come to the front right now as we stand and sing to encourage you.